everybody, and welcome to the inaugural session of the Massimo Rosati seminars, which I have the honor, the privilege, and the pleasure to open. The title that we have chosen, Religions and Space, the City as a Laboratory, is meant to remind us that the city of God and the human city, the transcendent and the immanent, the extraordinary and the everyday, coexist side by side in the urban space and in those special spaces that bring people to relate to their neighbors' different sense of how these moments are to be encoded. We're here also today to reflect on the findings of a research project on the new emerging patterns, worships to open up urban space, project funded by this university, and meant to investigate the way in which different constituencies negotiate religious complexity and diversity in a city like Rome, which is often and somehow misleadingly perceived as more homogeneous than it actually is. A more appropriate theme, I don't think, could have been chosen to open up what we hope will be the first in a series of encounters dedicated to the memory of our friend and colleague Massimo Rosati, the founder and also the first director of the CSPS, the Center for the Study of Religions and Political Institutions in a Post-Secular Society, in the 4th anniversary of his premature, totally unexpected, and in all respect tragic passing away at age 44 on January 30th, 2014. For those of you who were not acquainted with Massimo Rosati, he was one of the most talented and creative social theorists in this country and beyond. He certainly would have grown into a role of intellectual leadership in his field. He graduated with a dissertation on Habermas's then 1993 newly published Theory of Communicative Action, soon moved on to study republicanism and the vocabulary of Italian patriotism, and then at about the turn of the century, eventually came into his own when he started focusing on religion, the sacred and its relation to solidarity, the importance of ritual and the urban spatial dimension of religious life in contemporary so-called post-secular society. We are part here of a profession which attributes utmost importance to what we leave behind when we're no longer there. And I'd like to pay tribute today to my friend Massimo by recalling some way stations in his life work. I use this term because he indeed dedicated his life to the Weberian Wissenschaft als Beruf, science broadly understood as a vocation. In 2004, he edited a new translation of Durkheim's Elementary Forms of Religious Life, the most inspirational work of his most revered author. And his introduction to that text is now a landmark in Durkheimian scholarship. Later, in 2008, he co-edited with William Pickering, then the doyen of Durkheimian studies worldwide, the anthology Suffering and Evil, the Durkheimian Legacy, which gave him an international recognition, which is destined to remain a mere aspiration for many more senior than he was. At about the same time, in 2009, he defended an original Neo-Durkheimian account of the relation of ritual to the sacred of both ritual and the sacred to modernity. And this book, Ritual and the Sacred, a new Durkheimian analysis of politics, religion, and the self, was the first book that he chose to write in the language we're speaking now. Convinced as he was that writing in English would open up his work to the attention and scrutiny of a global public of same-spirited, not necessarily like-minded scholars. He then co-edited with Christina Stöckel an important collection on multiple modernities and post-secular societies, and at the same time, about 2009-10, started cooperating with the Reset Dialogue on Civilization Foundation, headed by Giancarlo Bosetti. He would then generously venture out of academia, and every other week he would feed posts to his blog, Living Together Differently. And these insightful reflections on current events, books, theoretical developments have been gathered recently by Valeria Fabretti and Alessandro Vitullo in a book by the same title. At the time of his passing, on his desk and in his computer, he had a completed manuscript which appeared posthumously in 2014, in time to be discussed on the occasion of the first anniversary. The title of the book is The Making of a Post-Secular Society, the Turkish Laboratory. This book, based on 5 years of research, combines an innovative sociological rethinking of the notion of post-secular society with an empirical analysis of the tensions inherent in Turkey's transition from a secularist to what was then thought to be a post-secular, post-Kemalist public culture. In the concluding section, Rosati broke new theoretical ground by propounding an original four-quadrant model of the transition towards a post-secular society. Now, the chronologically last of his achievements of late December 2013, something that he was very proud of, was his participation to an encounter of young German and Italian critical theorists with Jürgen Habermas near Frankfurt. I remember the painstaking, actually nearly obsessive care that he put into writing that paper, which is now published as The Archaic and Us, Ritual, Myth, the Sacred and Modernity. And I recall discussing parts of that paper with him at 6 o'clock in the morning sometimes. And I want to end with a quote from that piece. Because what I've mentioned so far are basically external, observable elements of an outstanding CV, publications, institutional commitments, and the like. But I've been close to Massimo personally, to his intellectual trajectory for over 2 decades and a half. And I think the homage I can offer to his memory is a recollection of the peculiar cipher or fil rouge of his life work. Deep down, Massimo has been seeking one and the same thing throughout this couple of decades. Initially, he thought he could find this thing in Habermas, then in the Republican, and partly also in the communitarian critiques of liberalism, but experienced disappointment all the time, until he found in Durkheim's sociology of the sacred a springboard from which to venture out into his own original reflection. What was this thing to which he remained faithful for a lifetime? It was the quest for a way of articulating a radical, antagonistic, anti-individualism. A kind of anti-individualism which he tried initially to retrieve from Habermas, the Habermas of the theory of communicative action, only to then be disappointed by Between Facts and Norms, a book of, which became available in Italian in 1995. Not to mention the disappointment brought to him by Habermas's famous exchange with Rawls in 1995. A radical anti-individualism, which he subsequently hoped to find in the republicanism of Frank Michelman and Bruce Ackerman, and in passing also in the Michael Walzer of Thick and Thin and of Interpretation and Social Criticism, only to be then disappointed by the sort of nonchalant way in which some of these figures would not hesitate to self-define themselves as Republican-liberals. Eventually, he found in Durkheim, especially in Durkheim's notions of the sacred and of ritual, an invaluable source for developing an anti-individualistic social theory. But then, moving on beyond Durkheim, and drawing on the work of Adam Seligman and the anthropologist Roy Rappaport, Massimo located in ritual the deep core of an anti-individualism typical of all religious life and impervious, resistant to be metabolized by the all-devouring forces of modernization. And during his last months, Massimo looked at Eliade as yet another inspiring source. In Eliade, he found a notion of the archaic, so-called, as yet another facet, aspect of anti-individualism. And in the scholarship on the axial age, which he followed very closely, he found corroborating testimony for the persistence, unabated persistence of archaic elements within the evolution of culture. Along with Durkheim and Robert Bellah, he would understand religion as the locus, the main, the principal locus of this archaic moment of transcendence. The locus of the sacred as an intrinsically heteronymous moment, precisely that which modernity tries to exercise, to subjugate, and to bring under the edges of so-called individual autonomy without ever fully succeeding. And one of the most thought-provoking insights reached by him during his intellectual trajectory, which is representative of this latest stage of his thinking, is found precisely in this paper, The Archaic and Us, discussed with Habermas in Frankfurt in 2013, and then published posthumously in Philosophy and Social Criticism. And echoing Adorno's idea that the Enlightenment experiences a mythical horror of myth, Massimo quips that nothing is less critical than the idea so widely shared within the milieu of critical theory that critique is the locus of reflection, and ritual instead is the locus of habit. Ritual instead must be understood, as he intimated, as so-called liturgical reflectivity. And as he put it, when there are rituals for everything, sleeping, eating, working, dressing, washing, and so on, then simply sleeping, eating, working, dressing, washing is not enough. One has to think how to sleep, how to eat, work, dress, wash, and so on. And everyday practices become much more reflective. Now, that ritual is a vehicle of reflection and not of habituation, and as such need not be expelled from a revisited understanding of modernity. And that religion and religious diversity intersect within the partitions of the urban space, I think, are the thought-provoking conclusions that Massimo came to when his life was approaching a premature end. And I think we honor his memory by engaging these thoughts in this following couple of 2 days. Thank you. Okay, we will now let me just introduce you. For those of you who may need, the few who may need an introduction, Professor Irene Becci is a faculty member of the Faculty of Theology and Science of Religion at the University of Lausanne. She studied at Sapienza, the University of Rome, and also in Erfurt, in Constance. Has been a visiting scholar at the New School for Social Research in New York and at NYU. And she's the author of a monograph, Imprisoned Religion, Transformations of Religion During and After Imprisonment in Eastern Germany, published with Ashgate in 2012. And also, Irene Becci has co-edited with Marian Burchard and Jose Casanova a collection of essays, Topographies of Faith, Religion in Urban Spaces, which came out with Brill in 2013. And the title of her paper today is The Making of Urban Spirituality, When Religious Practices Take Secular Spaces and Religious Spaces Profile as Secular. Welcome.
Thank you. Can I use this mic?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Turn it on.
You have to
turn it on.
Right. Okay, you can hear me then. Thank you. I'm very honored to be here. Very grateful to my colleagues, and also to be here for the second time for this series of lectures. It's extremely encouraging to present the work, actually, because I'm able to present work in progress, but still at a very high expectation of theoretical engagement, as you were just saying. I'm not sure I will really hold that level, but I will do my best. And today, actually, it's interesting. While I was preparing this speech today, I had the impression I would come back and talk about the same as 2 years ago, because actually I used the same case. I do empirically locate this research into the study of one city, but actually I really try to generalize from there and have more general statements. And where I was 2 years ago, it's not the same where I'm now, actually, for the same case, so I think it's not too much to expect you to follow me for the second time. And one word was not present last time, probably. It's the word spirituality. And I think around this word we can have a debate about what I then call basically this new making or new formations around the religious secular divide, basically. So this is my plan. I would like to first give some theoretical hints and make some statements more generally about what is the importance of this special term in the study of cities and religious diversity, and in general about religious change in secular societies, secularized societies. What does this bring into the debate, this special term? And then use, of course, the case of Potsdam, this Eastern German city. There are different reasons why I use this city as an exemplary illustration, First of all, as you have heard, this is not the first time I'm working on in Eastern German context, and it's probably one of the most challenging in terms of secular societies in Europe. It's really where you can actually, you would not go spontaneously if you want to look for religion and analyze religious change, because that's actually one of the most secularized areas of Europe in general. But that's precisely why it is interesting to find what I probably hope to convince you I found there in this an extreme high level of religious diversity and effervescence and innovation. So, oh no, this is here. Okay. Well, one of the large debates that is really affecting the idea about the city is that the cities are seen as the secular place of society. This is where Simmel clearly showed this urban character, the blasé type, the cosmopolitan character, where people actually are free, as this German saying said, Stadtluft macht frei. So as soon as you get into the city, since the Middle Ages actually, and Weber also showed it, they have this very strong sort of democratic impetus going on, and where there is enlightenment, where you have the science, places of the science, of scientific innovation, and challenging traditional structures. So the city actually was usually considered as, per excellence, the secular space. In recent secularization theories, those actually Massimo really strongly talked about, actually if you look at cities, this was sort of taken for granted that the city was the secular space, but actually the factors on which these theories were based were most of them were actually centered on actors and institutions. That is, secularization meant that in the city people would practice less, people would adhere less, would be less members of secular institutions. The churches were empty in terms of religious services. They were not longer used for what they were actually made for. So it's interesting to see that in this whole debate about secularization and the city as the per excellence secular place, the space itself, secular or religious spaces, and what, independently from what they were doing, if this action was qualified as religious or not, were quite absent. So in recent years, you had this new special perspective coming on into this debate and bringing in the idea that you have this new uses of these religious spaces. Clearly, you have all these studies about tourism, for instance, that you could now not take away a church from any city if this is a historical church, and not because there are a lot of people going there for religious services, but because it has become a symbol, an iconic place, and Birgit Meyer and their colleagues, Kinot and others, have this interesting European project on iconic religions. So these places are symbols of the city itself. They have actually increasing number of tourism, to a point that, for instance, I think also in Italy, a lot of places, but Milan, I'm sure that the Duomo of Milan and places in Zurich now had to introduce tickets for tourists in order to sort of regulate all the horde of people coming in, the masses. So how can you say these places are completely secularized if they are actually visited all the time by a lot of people and they actually can make money out of it? This means that the whole perspective of secularization was a sort of theological one, was to see that the places that were thought for religious, for a sort of religious function, had to really do that religious function, using that same place for another type of practice, a social practice, was not considered as in somehow interesting and either clearly necessarily religious. So the spatial perspective brings in certainly a new idea about this materiality of the place. Spaces do have a material presence in cities. They are at a symbolic level and at a material level, and they actually form and shape the experience, the sensorial experience of people in these places. So this is sort of banal, but it's still a new way of framing and criticizing the secularization hypothesis, to really taking the whole spatial term seriously. Now, what we can actually see if you take the places, religious places, not necessarily as the only official place where religious action can take place, But if you take the whole city as a laboratory, as you say actually in your title, and try to look at practices and the sensorial experiences and what people talk about, how they experience the places, different places, what you can really see in recent years is this sort of blurring of secular religious boundaries, of the secular religious divide, through special strategies. The case of Potsdam shows this very clearly. Before I go into more abstract and generalized statements, maybe we can pin this down on this Potsdam case, which needs a little bit of time to explain it to you, but then I hope we can maybe make some parallels with your Roman project tomorrow and others. And I think there's, in this making of spirituality in the urban context, this making of urban spirituality goes with the blurring of religious secular divide. Why? Because the notion itself, the way today the notion of spirituality is performatively used in a performative way, because basically spirituality has no clear content. If you ask whoever you want to ask, what do you mean when you say you're spiritual? You know, there's more and more statistics coming in and saying more and more people say they're more spiritual than religious, or they're not religious but spiritual, things like this. But then if you ask precisely what they mean by this, you have a completely open container. You go from being spiritual means adhering totally to my faith doctrine, to being extremely away from any faith doctrine. It can be deist, non-theistic, it's absolutely everything. So what is really interesting is this new performative use of spirituality as a new cultural category erupting and really not accepting this religious secular divide. So this new notion of spirituality can also be seen at a spatial level. We will see how exactly. And I think once you have this general picture in a way formulated about secular and religious places, the divide, and spirituality is a new third category in a way, hybrid category maybe, performatively used, then it's still necessary to look at how exactly, which processes do this, how exactly does this, is this enacted, how does it come into being in an urban context. And I identified with this Potsdam case, but of course maybe we can talk more about it, somehow one clear strategic process coming from the top, if you want, from city authorities. In recent years, city authorities have really changed their political way they involve religious communities into their politics. And I will show you through which are the topics there. What do city authorities do with religions? And on the other hand, a sort of a process rather based on economic processes. And I'm happy to say economic here. There's an economist in the audience. Maybe he will react to it. And this sort of socio-economic processes that bring actors to react or to adopt strategies in order to face them, basically. This is a rather, if you want, a bottom-up process, but not necessarily bottom-up in terms of resistance or contestations. It can be a bottom-up process linked to economic processes that actually are capitalistic processes. So we will see this, and the cases I will show that really illustrate these are, on the one hand, by the holistic milieu, this new spiritual milieu proposing holistic practices, and on the other, evangelical new groups that consciously adopt new strategies in the city. Okay. Now, to give you already some ideas, I don't think, many of you were of course not there 2 years ago, and the Potsdam case is an interesting case. We have been working on it for 8 years now. We hope this year, actually, we have to publish the book in June. So we have a deadline, we have the editor, we have everything. We have even the mayor who invited us to present the book officially to the authorities, just to show you how important actually it is to have this cartography for their political agenda. But we started actually in 2010, and we observed a big fluctuation, which means we observed communities that are still there, but we observed communities that are no longer there, others that just were born in the last 2 years. So it was really interesting to have such a project. One thing that seemed to be a weakness at the beginning, that we had very little fundings coming in regularly. So we had to take it in a long time. Actually, it was finally an advantage because we could see this fluctuation in a time of 8 years. And although Potsdam is not a big city, I'll show you it's 160,000 inhabitants more or less, in a post-socialist really context, strongly post-socialist, we still had about 80 communities and 40 more or less different denominations, considering all sort of, for instance, within the big religious tradition, within Christianity, etc. We approached in a first moment these communities through questionnaires, then we had interviews, and finally we actually had participant observations, we met people, and this is when at the very final stage we also introduced really strongly the state authorities, I mean the city authorities and their political involvement, which was not present at all when I came 2 years ago. We really had only first started with the communities, who is there, who are the religious actors, and then we saw the importance of actually the city itself. So I will really not go into the details, but Potsdam is interesting also because of its history. You may know this, of course, it's the cradle of Protestantism on one hand, but it's also a place where very quickly you had a sort of pluralism, because the prince itself decided to be Calvinist while he allowed the others to remain Lutherans. So it's very interesting. You had very quickly a sort of tolerance within the evangelical church, and then you had also very quickly these armies actually who needed soldiers from all over Europe. So very quickly you had already in the 18th century people coming from different religious backgrounds. So you had necessarily a sort of diversity for strategic use that was allowed. So tolerance is very present in this historical memory of the city. And one of it's this the Potsdam Tolerance Edict, maybe you have this in mind, which is of the 18th century, and where you clearly have the prince affirming that you need to tolerate the different religions, and that in Potsdam should be a place where you have, where everybody should be able to express his or own religion. And actually, even to be a Potsdamer meant to be a person of tolerance. It's interesting. And also, what is also interesting is this royal forces, the royal presence there, brought also sort of an enlightened idea of interest of esoteric traditions. You have in the parks of Potsdam still pyramids that were brought there in the 18th century by the princes. You have all this knowledge of somehow Oriental knowledge that was valorized. So you have also a tolerance which is really outside of Christianity and outside of the monotheistic traditions. But of course, all this was completely brought to zero during the, first of all, the Second World War, and then the socialist period, which was extremely important in Potsdam, where you had actually the center of the Red Army, and you had the high appointees of the Stasi, the police of the secret police, of the GDR, who were actually formed there, and so their families lived there. And for a long time, Potsdam was also, for the GDR citizens, the synonymous of secret police, Red Army, Russian, Soviet forces. So extremely, it's remembered by people as extremely intolerant, actually, for that period. Not at all this whole historical period remembers. So the population today, so you have, in a way, this sort of plurality in the history, which was brought to zero in the recent history. And then you have also some very recent development that make out of Potsdam, although it's a little city, and with actually not many immigrants, for instance, only 5% are non-nationals, but it's also a global city. It's interesting because, first of all, it's very close to Berlin, and you can go to Potsdam as if you took, if Tor Vergata is part of Rome, Potsdam is part of Berlin in a way. It's very close, it's even closer than Tor Vergata to the city center of Rome. And people commute all the time, and you have in Potsdam one of the biggest number in a very narrow place, finally, scientific institutes based there. So there's this whole idea of the global city, as Saskia Sassen, with high qualified employees who live now there and who settled actually down. And the population has changed a lot in these recent 15 years, more or less. people leaving and newcomers settling down. But all this remained quite secular until recently. And what we found actually is nevertheless quite some diversity in terms of already Protestant churches, Catholic churches, Christian communities, Jewish community. Actually, I put it in the singular, but there are many different Jewish communities. Also, although they are not many in number of members, but they don't agree on many topics, so they have different communities. And actually, if you compare what we counted as how many members all these people are in these communities with the statistical data that you have of the city, we have much higher numbers. Because we also counted, for instance, what we call all the yoga networks around yoga schools with singing and with really ritual, strong groups meeting there for 10 years or even longer. So we thought if we consider some Christian groups as religious, we have to consider them also in our research. And actually have much higher number than we thought at the beginning. And some really tiny groups, as the Baha'i community, for instance, which is just a couple of people in the city, are extremely present in all interreligious dialogues, in all visible events. That's another interesting finding we did. So, okay. Now, what did the city recently? What we really realized actually is that the city recently clearly actively had a sort of bringing religions into the public, very clearly. So how did they? First of all, they did around issues about memory. We are in Germany, we had, Second World, we had the Shoah, we had all these events. Around them, each time the city had to organize a ritual, clearly about remembering the night of the Rome night or any other period that was linked to the Shoah. They involved the religious community, clearly. They addressed them and they asked them to come and even sometimes to organize. They used the churches to organize these meetings. So the memory of actually war events was linked to religious communities, clearly, actively by the people of the cities, the city authorities. The city authorities also support a lot of foundations that are actually religious foundations, linked to hospitals, schools, all sorts of charity work, which is kind of strange for a secular city, but they do it very clearly. They are part of big interreligious dialogue, and it has become really a factor that absolutely needs to be there if any community wants to have some integration into the city. They have to be involved into interreligious dialogue, which also requires by the communities to have language access, to have a lot of other resources that many of them don't have, new migrants in particular. And also all sorts of regulations. But it's interesting because the city, in Germany actually, the city has no authority. Legally speaking, it's not their job to regulate anything about religious diversity, because it's at the level of the land, if you want, it's at the level of the region, not at the level of the city. So here we have so what actually the city is doing all the time is to try to find a good argument, a strategic way to organize its links, its relations to religious. One is memory, as I said, another is order and security issues. So as soon as they have to organize the cemetery or a new bank holiday or issues that arise, could be conflictual, they actually feel entitled to involve the communities to solve these issues. But they are not doing this in terms of really religious politics. It's not politics, but it's politics about security and order. And interestingly, they did a lot of events to involve the cities, the churches. For instance, the very last one, this is what I just said. The very last one is clearly this, which actually just happened last year in 2017, as you can see, because it was the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. So the church, the state authorities, the city authorities organized in the railway station of Potsdam a big exhibition called The Churches and Diversity, showing all the photographs, all the churches of the city and their history, the churches that were bombed, those that still exist, how many different people actually they contain, because you have these Huguenots, you have many Calvinists and all sorts of Christian churches actually. And it's interesting how you had this clearly post-socialist city invaded with the railway station. Next to the shops and next to business issues, you had this photo exhibition of the churches organized by the city. This is one of the first ways how you can see that clearly the city brings in religion into the public space and transforms the use of public space. Public space suddenly becomes a place, like the railway station, where you are brought to think, to reflect on religion, on the past, on the present, and on diversity. There are many examples like this in the recent years. One of them is just also the whole museum, the art about how you exhibit. And it's interesting, in the city map, you can see around the 18th century, what you can see most are the churches. Although you could have other very important buildings of the city. But the churches are really an emblematic place, really, for the identity itself of the city. And many, of course, also the whole topography of the city, the ways, there's an issue about GDR memory and older memories, how you call the squares, how you call the streets, but many of the streets and squares, etc., still have this Christian past. And it's interesting also to see the contrast. One of the pictures in the middle, you can see the contrast of the socialist architecture just facing older, like new classical style churches, which here is the Huguenot, the Calvinist church, for instance. And some really tiny communities, like the building there, are actually having a really big building in the city center. This is the case of there's an autonomous Lutheran church. Actually, very few people know it around the world. And interestingly also, a couple of years ago, in 2012, Potsdam, with a professor of the University of Potsdam, also the involvement of universities is very important, they applied for a national call for innovative project, and they won, creating a new, what they call a new Potsdamer edict, Toleranz edict, and they became actually public funding, where you had as a name to create a place where you can actually favorize, encourage diversity, talk about diversity, and religion was very strongly part of it from the beginning. So it's also interesting to see all this, in a way, memory work, where actually the GDR is sometimes just wished away, and you can just go back in the 17th century in the memory work. And it's very important. They are having many exhibitions. Show me some. For instance, exactly. In 2008, this was created, but then they organized a whole year, actually, debates and public events all the time, where some issues had to be faced. For instance, with this very interesting title, Anders als du glaubst, which is, it's not what you think, but in Germany it's not what you believe. So it's interesting to think, on the one hand they play on this idea that you present believers as something that is completely the alterity for the Potsdam people, because there's just 80% of people who are not belonging to any religion in the city. But on the other hand, you also show the diversity, so you actually get to know religion directly as a diversity factor. Well, this is about the history. I think this is quite clear how public space is used and for issues that concern religion, but also there are a lot of examples to show that the city authorities asked historical religions to open up their religious places for public events. So there are many this back and forth, so they want them to use their religious spaces for secular issues like debates, as I said here, and they use the secular places for talking about religion. So there's a really active politics going on there. Another active politics is around migration, and it has changed extremely since the 2015 crisis. You all heard about Angela Merkel's, of course, affirmation, and although there's a whole history, as this also shows, of migration in Potsdam, very recently actually, where is it? Okay, I will find it also. Oh yes. Very recently, the number of immigrants has grown very strongly after 2015. This is exactly what I want to show. As you can see, for a little city as Potsdam, between 2014 and 2015, the number has just grown of 1,000 more refugees coming into the city, as they used to have, 72 per year in 2011, growing to 1,494 in 2015. So for a little city as Potsdam, this was very clearly, they had a very visible impact. So authorities were really facing the idea of, you have to integrate these new people, you have to do active politics, and they really called the churches to participate into this new integration activities. And they used a lot of rhetoric, although they were using religion in a way, a rhetoric that called rather back to the GDR time. For instance, this Eine Stadt für alle, the claims in 1989 when the war came down was, we were one folk, we are one people. So this idea, we are one people and we want one city to welcome everybody and to integrate. And very clearly also the churches there had to play a clear role in the debates with the Pegida movement you probably heard about, which was not very strong in Potsdam but still had an effect in Potsdam. So the state authorities really asked the churches to come there and to participate. And in their idea of how you can use, what religion has to do in order to integrate people, place is one of the three, the three aims is to just to make a mediation between the different identities around faith, to make people more sensitive about religion in general, and really to, the second point, Räume für Glaubensgemeinschaft schaffen, which means create places for these communities. So the place itself, it was sort of a big aim of the integration process. Communities have to have a place. However, this place is a very contested issue. As I said, the city is not deciding anything about religion. It's the land that can do it. So one issue was around the Muslim community, which of course grew hugely after 2015, because among these refugees, 80% were from Syria and other countries with Muslim background, if you want. So clearly they had this news coming into the newspaper, all the Muslims are outside of their mosque, which is a very small place. And so what the city did, they actually hired, which was very costly for them, they had to spend a lot of money, they hired the Orangerie, which is actually a place of the Botanic Garden, a marvelous, huge place, and the Muslim community could do their prayers in the Botanical Garden, actually, of Potsdam, which created also sort of very exotic, exotized image of these Muslims, and they had to justify it just in terms of order, because there was no budget for religious issues. So there was a budget for security, and they used actually that budget to have the Muslims use that place. So that's another sort of strategy where you use secular places, like a botanical garden, for religious practices, or orchestrated actually by city authorities. This is not an initiative coming from the Muslim community. This is really the city authorities doing it. So, and apart from this use really orchestrated by the authorities itself, as I said, there's another change. It's this emergence of a holistic milieu. Clearly, I cannot show you now, but there's a whole city map showing where are the more gentrified areas of the city, where are the poorer areas, and all these initiatives around yoga. You have a lot of, it's interesting, there's a lot of success about geomancy in Potsdam. It's more in Germany, also maybe in Northern Europe, but not very much here. But this whole idea of actually using space itself to make some sort of divination, to read into space. Feng Shui is maybe more known practice in these geomantic ideas. Meditation practices, ecological spirituality, all sort of new age offers are present in the gentrified area where touristic shops are very common, really in the passage of gallerias, etc., where you can have other sort of really high, trendy shops. And apart from this, there's also a whole idea about what is private, what is public. A lot of things are going on in the people's houses also, in the apartments, like the Baha'i meet in their apartments, Jehovah's Witnesses meet in their apartments, but they're still very visible when it comes to interreligious dialogue, for instance. So of course the processes of the city and the economic processes in a way, sometimes they overlap. it's not so clearly easy to distinguish them, but still they show different trends. One is more oriented to some sort of capitalistic, if you want, strategies, how you face a very expensive place, actually, how you can pay it, so you have to get more commercial in your offer. And on the other, you use political issue like memory or integration, or in a strategic way to be involved as a religious actor. So I think I get closely into conclusion. Yeah, thank you. It's interesting also, I talked about post-socialism. This is just to show you one very interesting, one last example maybe to illustrate this, is what is called the city churches. More and more, in particular evangelical churches, really have a concept about how to become, how to have a success in a way, gain new member, implant your community in a city. And it's very interesting to see this. For instance, you can see this is the map of, there's a whole network of city churches in Germany. As you can see, the whole area of Eastern Germany is very empty compared to Western Germany. So things still exist about post-socialism. It's not just an invention, so this shows it clearly. And this very interesting example of this city church is one called Mittendrin. It's a church, it's actually coming already from the 19th century. It's a historical free church in Germany, but they are completely new in Potsdam. There's no community, just a couple of families settled down in Potsdam and decided they wanted to create a new community. So what did they do? They did not at all do what maybe sociologists would expect, like place-making strategies, to build a new space or to ask for permission. They hired places for an office. They hired, they got more or less in connection with two persons, members of the community, who opened up two cafes, and they hire for their religious services the cabaret, which is actually the satirical place of political satire in Potsdam. Completely irreligious, extremely critical of society, a satire place, as you could know in Potsdam. And actually it works quite well. In just a couple of years they have gained a lot of members, although the membership is not that official at the beginning now, but they present artists, they make evenings of readings in their cafes. You could not recognize from the outside that this is an evangelical cafe. It's a normal cafe, very nice, in the city center, with a terrace and everything. And they invite people on Sundays, not every Sunday, for a very very fashioned service with microphone and music, and everything is taken care of, children and everything. You can have the podcast on their internet website. The website was there before the community itself. So, but they're very popular. They're gaining a lot of people. And if you talk to the persons that actually go there for the services, we did some interviews. Most of them really talk about this sensual experience in terms of it's different. I don't feel I'm going into a church. I'm feeling I'm having an experience. It's nice, and I can go away if I want, and they take care of my children. And it's extremely high. If you want the profile of people are not migrants. These are Germans who more or less got away from religion in 1 or 2 generations, and now sort of approach again to it. Okay, so gentrification, I talked about it. Of course, there's also a use of religion in the resistance to this gentrification. There's social protests using also symbols about religion. Luther is, on the one hand, is celebrated. On the other, he's also accused as the authoritarian person. Actually, that brought then Germany to Nazism, etc. So, with people going against the government. So it's interesting to see that you have both. And although religion is very absent in terms of people and membership, it's extremely present in the political struggles and in the cultural life of the city. Okay, so. Of course, in this making up a memory, bringing in religion into the public, or religious profiling as public, there's a whole selection process at work. So some religious communities remain completely invisible. These are in particular migrant African origin religions that they never saw there, but they do exist. There are some, of course, also who want to remain secret society, as Simon would say. And there's also an issue about what time do you valorize in this memory work? Why is systematically the GDR seems to be really in the political struggles one of that period that is a big issue. Some want to maintain it, others want completely to eliminated in the memory of the work. And religion works around that too. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Irene. And as I see from our program, we're having a discussion all together of the three papers. Thanks for this one. I then suggest that we hear the second presentation by Annie Grave, and then we'll have a third one, then we'll have perhaps a short break of 5 minutes or so. And or not, maybe not. If we can, if we don't need to, then we can go on with questions. And please. Okay. Let me introduce Annie Grave, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the Department of Society and Globalization of Roskilde University in Denmark, and also Head of Studies of Social Science, of the Social Science Study program there. She's been a visitor twice, actually, in Rome at the academy, the Danish Academy in Rome, and also at the New School in New York and at Tokyo University. And she's the author of one book about the Japanese experience, Sanctuaries of the City, Lessons from Tokyo, published with Routledge in 2011. And the title of our presentation today is Urban Sanctuaries as an In-Between Phenomenon.
I prefer to stand up. Can you hear me? You're not that many.
Turn on the microphone. Oh, it's on.
Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here today. This first slide is not about urban sanctuaries in Tokyo. It is about the book. And the book, I think, is very interesting because it deals with friendship in the academic world. And it deals with the importance of acknowledging other people's work. And therefore, I came to think about it when I was thinking about Massimo Rosati. I have known Massimo since 2000. I met him in Copenhagen at a workshop organized by the European Sociological Association. And we both gave a paper on the role of the sacred in social theory. And then afterwards we began exchanging point of views in emails and in letters. And what I really found extraordinary was this practice of acknowledging the other person and show it, even though you disagree in very many different central aspects. I would think it was an example of friendship in the academic world, which I would say is a way of relating and praising the works of others. It is an atmosphere in which one author expresses praise and commendation, and it is valuable, particularly in a time dominated by a culture of competition in the academic world. I know much about it because I'm head of studies and I see things a bit from above. So it is about critical and careful reading of unfinished texts. And it is about when you are yourself writing a book or something, you don't forget the other person. You are very conscious about mentioning the other. So I think that was what characterized my friendship with Massimo Rosati. I only met him about, I think, 4 times. Once in Oxford, where you also were there. And with Massimo, I shared an interest in Durkheimian studies. So it was in the main the late work of Durkheim, the elementary forms of religion's life, that we discussed. In this presentation, I will share with you my thoughts about Durkheim, how I have made use of his late work in a study of Tokyo, and finally the perspectives of his we can learn from today. So why is Durkheim still of interest to us? I think it was in Oxford I learned the right pronunciation of Durkheim. I learned that it is Durkheim. So Durkheim. So why is he still of interest to us? I think there are 5 important points to be made. The first one is that he was a sociologist with a cosmopolitan outlook. As David Chanillo writes, Durkheim is the only writer in this group of classical sociologists to have made explicit use of the term cosmopolitanism. Second, when he speaks about individualism, he distinguishes between 2 types of, 2 concepts or ideas about individualism, and he goes for a concept of cosmopolitan individualism. Third, there's this idea of the sacred sanctuary, and fourth, this idea of the sacred sanctuary, I would say that it is a dynamic concept. It's very important. It's not static, but dynamic. And then urban sanctuaries as an in-between phenomenon, I would try to introduce to you how I have made use of Durkheim in my own studies of Tokyo. And then finally I will say something about the analytical strategy. I think it's very much in the line of yours. It's a practical material turn which he actually goes for in social theory. So a cosmopolitan with a a sociologist with a cosmopolitan outlook. The Elementary Forms was published in 2012, only 2 years before the outbreak of World War I. Indeed, a strange book for the time. Durkheim was a moderate patriot and only a pacifist insofar as he believed in an international order to outlaw war. He believed that France should defend itself when attacked. Yet his patriotism was questioned. Did he not come from Épinal in Lorraine? And he was a Jew, excluded per se from the French community along with Protestants, foreigners and Freemasons. One would have expected a volume that could form some kind of answer that would dwell on conditions for perpetual peace along the lines of, for instance, the thoughts of Immanuel Kant. But Durkheim published a book on Australian Aboriginals to demonstrate that this totemic cult can be categorized as a real religion no less than the major world religions, to such extent that we can learn from analysis of this symbols known religion about our own. If we turn our attention to the European scene of today, there are some similarities. European societies, they tend to understand themselves to be under pressure by global forces. Member countries of the European Union emphasizes patriotic pride as a virtue. It gives rise to critical concerns as expressed by Martha Nussbaum. She writes, I believe that this emphasis on patriotic pride is both morally dangerous and ultimately subversive to some of the worthy goals patriotism sets out to serve. These goals would be better served by the very old ideal of the cosmopolitan, the person whose primary allegiance is to the community of human beings in the entire world. Also today we see a resurgence of religion, and I think in our context today the elementary forms of religious life might be a bit more relevant. Faith communities and religious movements seem to be gaining political importance as contributors to the provision of more political and legal norms. And in this context, the late work of Durkheim is relevant, not least because of its, you could say, universal take on religion. he would say that it is not only for minorities to be attached to religion. It is central to all people, including also modern ones. In my work, I have continued in the same line of thought. I would say that coming to terms with modernity goes through processes of Bearbeitung, that is, processes in which individuals mentally work on a social reality, its expectations, dreams, and sufferings, and these are enacted in sanctuaries set apart. They offer a framework in which our empirical observations arrange themselves and which enable us to think about them. So, in all, the cosmopolitan outlook of Durkheim would be his take on religion, that religion is not only for minorities, that religion is not only for traditional societies, and I think he would be very skeptical when talking about post-secular society, because it assumes that once upon a time there had been a secular society, and I think he would question that. So the second thing is about the cosmopolitan individualism. And the central core of his work, of Durkheim, is how does a kind of moral obligation emerge in societies where individuals is the only belief system, where individualism is the only belief system that can ensure a society's moral unity. With a focus on the cult of individualism and the personality, Durkheim inscribes himself into an issue of central importance for our standing of our time, marked by acceleration, as said by Hartmut Rosa, or individualization, which is the central point of Ulrich Beck. In that line, in that same line, you could say that Durkheim was a modernist, and he believed in an ideal of emancipated individualism. He was, in a way, an optimist compared to the other classical sociologists. He distinguishes between two concepts of individuality. One, I'm sorry, I have to have something to... Yet one which is a utilitarian one in the tradition of Herbert Spencer, which reduces individuality to utilitarian selfishness. This concept is associated with moral poverty, he said, and in practice has only few followers. The second concept of individuality is one that goes beyond the limit of utilitarian ends, according to which the only ways of acting that are moral are those which are fitting for all men equal, that is to say, which are implied in the notion of man in general. It is in this second meaning of the concept that drives Durkheim's work. And opposed to the assumption that religious life gradually disappears in modern society, the elementary forms provides a strong argument for religion's continuous importance, because the idea of society is the soul of religion. So, I'm sorry. Here, this is a slide, a photo from the German-French Reformed Church in Copenhagen, and it shows the official memorial service for the victims of the Paris attack on November 13, 2015. And here you could say that the importance of religion here shows itself because it offers a place, a sanctuary, or a framework for coming to terms with an instance of sacrilege. You could say the violation of the sacred, which was came to the fore very much in 2015. So there was a need to get together and reconfirm to one another the importance of the sacred in society, he would say, I think. And here also he would emphasize the power of religion. The fact that it is not only as belief system that religion matters, but also, and in particular, as a form of practice, as ritual acts, as a religious act, he says, set the collective in motion, groups come together to celebrate them. So, he again questions the Protestant disdain for mere ceremonies in that it misconceives the fundamental conditions of religious life. So, that was about the cosmopolitan individualism. So, all people, including modern ones, are in need of religion, and defined in terms of the sacred. So it's not just a religion, Protestant or so, but in terms of the sacred, and religion shows itself in instances of sacrilege. A need to confirm to one another what is sacred to the society. So now we proceed to the sanctuary. So what is a sanctuary? What does it mean, and what has it meant to evoke the term sanctuary? We have central to ideas of sanctuaries are central to the ideas of nature preserves and protected zones for animals. It can be sanctuaries can be for political exiles, refugees, asylum, extraditions, or as a third alternative, the sacred sanctuary. So I will say a bit about the difference between the three. So first, the second one, I will not say something about the national sanctuary, but the church as a sanctuary for asylum seekers. We see more churches these years who has opening the church for people who are refugees from, for instance, Syria, and they use it as they make use of what you could say the initial idea of the church as a form of sanctuary where everybody are free to come. Jacques Derrida, in his late work on hospitality, he speaks about a vision of a city for refugees. He asks, can we still maintain the dream of a new status for the city, not a reconstructed classical city? We dream of an open city or a city for refugees where people also live as world citizens. It is a city where strangers who have been forced to flee because of their beliefs can find a refugee. And then we have the sacred sanctuary as developed in Durkheim in his late studies. I have tried. It really took me some time to figure out how to read this book, the elementary forms, and at a certain time, my husband said, "Well, perhaps you should just quit your job. You're not clever enough." It's so strange, that book. But then, at a certain moment, I came to see some parallels with the work of Sigmund Freud. It sounds a bit strange, but it was as parallels in his way of reading, a reading strategy, so to speak. So you can see there's a convergence with Freud's psychoanalysis, but this is social analysis. So you can say that with Freud, it is about the psychic life, which shows itself in forms of individual representations within the framework of the clinical practice in psychoanalysis. If you go to Durkheim, you could say social life manifests itself as collective representations within the restricted framework of the ritual, the religious ritual. And the religious ritual, it develops itself in sequences. You have the negative rites and the positive rites, you have the sacrifice, and you have the mimetic rites, and all these things. And there are striking similarities in how he perceives social life, how it comes through in shops and such things. And second, his approach is, he says that religion is defined in terms of the sacred, and it shows itself, as I said before, in instances of sacrilege. Then the religious sanctuary or the religious ceremony offers a framework for Bearbeitung to reel the film forward and back. That is processes in which individuals mentally work on a social reality, its expectations, dreams, and sufferings. And you can say, yeah. So there are two aspects I think I would put forward about sanctuary life. The first one is about the social life going on. And I think we could say it is a learning lab for codes of civility. I think that was one very predominant point of Durkheim. The ritual is a game, a theatre, an extraordinary performance, and it has to be done in exactly the same way. It is highly formalized, encoded in a canon, and therefore exactly repeatable. And we have to do the same. We have to stand up and sit down and at the same time. And in that sense, we are equal to each other. And in that sense, we learn how to act with strangers, he would say. Secondly, it's a playground for sacred drama. The display of strong mythologies sets up an intermediate realm for reflection and second thoughts. Some will be fundamental, of a fundamentalist kind and backward-looking. Paul Connaughton, in his book How Societies Remember, would say that it is backward-looking rights, but then there are also other types of rights that are more open up. It can bring different sorts, so it can container dimension of the rights comes to the fore here. So you could say that the sanctuary or the sanctuary life has a certain kind of ambiguity or vagueness. In principle, it can be filled with what people bring with them. So in that sense, a container dimensions, which you also put forward before. Okay. So this is more or less what I concluded when saying what is the sacred sanctuary about. It's a dynamic concept, and in Durkheim's work, and it has these aspects. So, as the same slide again, you can rethink this situation within exactly a Durkheimian way of analyzing the situation. So, religion and the modern. Here are some quotes from Durkheim. The true function of religion is to make us act and help us live. The believer is a man who is stronger. The believer can believe in many different things, but the believer is a stronger person. The performance of religious orthodoxies belongs to the very nerve of all religions. It is this doing that will form the cult. And one could also add that there are certain universals across the main world religions that are similar, and which is one reason why different religious people of different religious observation can indeed share or be in the same type of church and then share a moment. And then finally, religion seems destined to transform itself rather than disappear. I have a feeling that I'm talking too much.
No.
Okay, so the last thing, which is very important, religion seems destined to transform itself rather than disappear. It's very important, I think, in the work of Durkheim. He also speaks about the transfer of sacred things into new phenomena. And it is from here that I have turned to the urban sanctuary. So within religion, the sanctuary is a place of a completely different order compared to the profane space that surrounds it. The place has the quality of a vacuum. In the words of this Marais, the sacred place is reserved for the permanent dwelling of a symbolic and juridical constituent instance of the social order and asymmetric other. It also say that if you want to look after new sanctuaries, new types of spaces with sanctuary qualities, there are certain aspects you have to take a closer look at. It is spatial in the sense that there are certain social spheres in every city which have the quality of a sanctuary. It is temporal, it's not permanent, in that an interval of time is created when sanctuary conditions take over. There's a moment of sanctuary situations. The place has the quality of a sanctuary when it receives meaning from the ongoing meetings and exchanges and offers a specific kind of space which makes those meetings possible through the presence of a physical barrier, a symbolic border, and an imagined surface. So this is more so about how you can think about it and how you can also, if you are thinking about homeless people, for instance, how they try to create some kind of safe space around them in different ways. Again, what is important here, it gives it a certain ambiguity or vagueness, which in principle can be filled with whatever people bring with them. So it is from here on that I have entered my study of Tokyo. The city is among the largest in the world, with more than 35 million inhabitants. It is a command center for the global economy. And what is interesting here is that it also belongs to the top 3 most livable cities in the world. So it also works, so to speak, in a social sense. So here we have a puzzle. Tokyo development poses one of the most insistent puzzles of modern urban history. How can an oversized capital of a nation with an almost unbreakable language code, struggling with its far from proud nationalist heritage, manage to metamorphose in a few short decades into a formidable global city? You could also add that Japan have 2 religions, main religions. One is Shinto, which believe very much in animism, and the other one is Buddhism. And these religions are not really considered as real religions. They are more considered as immature. So you have here an idea of an immature culture, so to speak, and it has really caused puzzles in sociology. Perhaps it is not, perhaps we can talk about different routes to modernity, or we can talk about another modernity or we can talk about societies that pretend that they are modern, but they are not really modern behind the face. Such things, all these things has been discussed a lot in Japan studies. And here I would say that I have taken a Durkheimian stance, saying, well, this is a real religion, just as the main world religions. And when we talk about real religions, we have to go back and say what defines a religion. It is defined in terms of the sacred and in terms of the rituals, you could say, the ritual life. So, what you could say, there are two main explanations for Tokyo being a global city, an important city that even also is a livable city. One is that they have learned everything from the West, they have learned from America, and they have learned from Europe, and they learn fast. So you could say that global cities are functional alike, and if you want to be a global city, you have to be functional alike. The other explanation is that goes back and say Tokyo is not merely a recent outcome of an Euro-American urban model, saying, well, history matters, and this mega city is based on a large urban society with roots going as far back as the 17th century. For example, by 1720, Edo, Tokyo was one of the largest cities in the world with 1.23 million inhabitants. So you could say that they are used to urbanism as a way of life. They are used to the urban experience in many different ways. It's an old history, so to speak, for them. I have worked with a thesis saying that what remains of earlier stages in Tokyo is the East Asian, you could say, utopian early modern city in which theater was a key order of representation. We see striking, we are visiting striking persistence of this type of utopian urbanism in Tokyo of today. So what I have worked with is this idea of the urban sanctuary and a transfer of sacred identity into new things. I have looked at the marketplace, sanctuaries for performing arts, and the religious sanctuary. The first is the marketplace. In Edo, you'd say that when you are making contract making, you would say cheating is forbidden. In matters of credibility, there's something beyond personal interests that works as categorical imperatives, no matter what we think, and that makes us live up to the rules, norms, and values that action on the market, in fact, also rests upon. Its working is conditioned by the strength of a society. A weak society without clear-cut mechanisms for answering sacrilege promotes a culture of corruption. So here I have taken a closer look into the ceremonial aspect of contract making in the marketplace in Edo, and with a focus on the tea ceremony and the importance of this ceremony when you actually make a deal, so to speak. You make some different kind of arrangement, and I have tried to compare it with the sacred drama. So you can say in all, the marketplace they have aspects of the sacred drama. It is a learning lab for civility. people did things differently there. They were supposed to come as free and act as such, otherwise there would be no trading. But it was also a playground for sacred drama, you could say, forms of collective representations, word that enabled abstraction of a particular quality, enabling exchange of goods and success. The second sanctuary that I have looked at is the hobby circles, places for performing arts, and I have also here tried to focus on, in particular, the rituals that they were marked by. Here it is, you could say, hobby circles were very widespread during the Edo era. They were, you could say, marked by, you could say, as Granveda says, the strength of weak ties, that people, they came together from around Japan to meet, to perform in a kind of poetry slam clubs, and they had to stick to particular rules when performing or when they made these poems. One very, we know all about haiku poems, and until I learned about these hobby clubs, I thought that you would sit alone and make 3 lines and say, well, perhaps I can make a splash out of it or not. But that was not the way they were practicing that in the early modern era. They were actually, it was a collective thing. They were sitting in a circle, and one person said one line, and then the second, and then hopefully the third one would make a kind of splash or whatever. In 2007, I happened incidentally to watch one of these hobby clubs in Tokyo, and it was very, very interesting for me to see that how they were performing in reality. So they are still very persistent there. So it was privately organized poetry hobby clubs. Somewhere, you could say, between friends and enemies lies the domain of strangers, characterized by a large network intersection. So enemies of friends. So it was the warrior, it was the peasant, it was all kind of people who participated in that and had access to these clubs. It was a learning lab for codes of civility. It was a ritual that you had to conform to, and it has to be done in exactly the same way, with exactly the same procedure every time. And it was, in a way, a playground for sacred drama, and a framework for fundamentalism, but also it could be a framework for free play. And again, if we switch to contemporary Tokyo, here we have the street dance, and what is interesting here is that it is, on the one hand, it is very ritualized. You really have to follow your straight rules, and on the other hand, you have this splash. You can do unforeseen things. You can also, what is also interesting in Tokyo is that they are very fond of free jazz, and in free jazz you have the same. You have very restricted rules, and then you have the jam session. So you don't know what will be the next tune. Finally, we have the religious sanctuary, and what I have been looking after is 2 elements of the religious ceremonies. One is a Japanese term named sakariba. It's called, it means seeking density. And the other is seeking ritual, which is the time of this sanctuary. So seeking density deals with fascination of the crowd. Fascination in the sense that if you are in a crowd, if there's a lot of noise, you can gain a kind of anonymity. You can become an anonymous person. And from here on, you can exchange points of views of many different ways dealing with what it is to be a human being with all these, a new type of conversation, we could also say. And it is this fascination of the crowd and effervescence, you could say here Durkheim's notion of collective effervescence is significant because it highlights the immense sociological significance of collective experience of emotion for the transformation of social life. A guy named Bochner, he writes that the techniques of ecstasies are not limited to the new urban environment of Japan, but can be discovered in the rituals of the many traditional Shinto and Buddhist festivals Matsuri still celebrating today. So we have seeking the crowd, fascination of the crowd, and seeking ritual, which is of course very different, silence and ritual, going back and so on. So they're both at work in talking. So finally, and you could also say that the point is that these in the Edo period, which lasted from 1600 to 1867, sanctuaries were refined, and paradoxically, the rigidity made possible the time of the moment, the time of theatre, a playground for teaching people how to make a life with those who are not like themselves. So this is one point. So finally, what can we learn from Durkheim? I think that the handling of sudden changes, according to Durkheim, is closely linked to being able to work on trauma socially. It's not just an intellectual process, it is bodily, rhythmic and collective. It takes place ceremonially, is rule-based and is situated in space and time. Durkheim therefore contributes to a practical material turn in cultural and social theory. It is a shift from how we comprehend the world to how we handle it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you. And we move on to our third contributor. And then we'll have the discussions. My pleasure now to introduce Gwendalina Salimé, who is professor at the Faculty of Architecture in the Sapienza University of Rome. She has graduated also from there and gotten her doctoral degree in theory and design of architecture. See? Evidente. And okay. Okay, meanwhile I continue my introduction. She is not only an academic, but also an active practicing and famous, actually, architect. And so I won't mention books, but I'll mention buildings and projects. Much more. It's the privilege of dealing with much more concrete matters than we academics do. And so she's the founder and director of a tea studio office in Rome, which works out architectural projects. She has received many prizes for her architectural work, and I will mention here the multifunctional building at via Bembo Street in Rome, the renovation of the Corviale building in Rome, which is actually underway, finished?
No, not finished.
Not finished.
It's finished, but not
okay.
Corviale.
And the Dao Viet Eco City in Ha Long Bay, world famous Ha Long Bay in Vietnam, and a number of other projects. She's been the coordinator of the Italo-German Symposia at the Academy of Architecture in Villa Vigoni, and also, which is particularly relevant for our topic here, the director of a master for planning worship places and a number of other things, which I won't mention, but the title of her presentation here is Urban Sanctuaries as an in-between, Interfaith Cultural Centers. Interfaith Cultural Centers, places for dialogue, studying, and playing.
I'm sorry because I'm an architect, so I don't know if there is really the topic of your discussion, but I try to put some ideas in these slides, and so I simplify a little bit the problem, of course, architectural problem, because I know that you're not architecture, so I don't want to be really technical, and so put in on the discussion some ideas. I think it's 3 years that we invent this kind of master, because the architects, these funny things, but they don't think about this problem, and in fact we don't find a lot of typology of this interreligious center in the world. Just we can see later one building, but it's not built, so it's just a project. So we decide to do this particular master of our university, and I think it's quite interesting because they say, and the Islamic Quraysh, the Islamic center in Rome, also the Jewish center in Rome, they are really interested in this kind of idea. So we are quite at the beginning of this this working. So I don't know, but probably we can build this kind of center around the world, more or less. I begin with some architecture builds monuments, place the recall events, historical periods, also period marked by the prevalence of a specific culture or human sensibility. In some case, architecture arouses in a property role. Looking to the future, it proposes to realize places that clearly show trends, though not yet fully matured, fully present. For instance, in this regard, for example, I don't know if you remember the House of Peace wanted by Simon Peres in Tel Aviv, designed by Studio Fuchs, that you know very well because it's a really good firm in Rome, to aim for the dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians. But up to now, ecumenical dialogue and interreligious were based on mutual respect and something on common action in the name of peace as a shared value among the religious on the world. For instance, the peace march of Assisi or something like that. There are many organizations now working for the dialogue. For example, the World Council of the Church, over the dedication of Hans Kung to the Global Ethical Foundation, funded to promote interreligious dialogue. that respect the fundamental similarity and difference between religion. But the 20th century opened with unresolved misunderstanding and conflicts between different cultures and faiths, opened while the need for knowledge of different identities were growing up. The current situation sees the spread of clash, violence, and persecution motivated by religious reasons, and a step towards interfaith dialogues is needed urgently. What does interreligious dialogue mean? Of course, it is always an architectonic point of view. Interfaith dialogue refers to cooperative, constructive, and positive interaction between people of different religions. Tradition coming to a mutual understanding and respect that allows them to live and cooperate with each other in spite of their difference. Build understanding and confidence to overcome or prevent tension. So far, ecumenical dialogue and interreligious dialogue worked for the mutual understanding and enrichment and for the common action for peace as a shared value among the religions of the world. But now it's clear that the interreligious center can be a good start for the realization of a more serious and lasting dialogue. It's the idea that architecture can intervene in order to reduce social conflicts based on religious intolerance and at the same time encourage an interreligious ecumenical dialogue that lays in the foundation of mutual respect for specific identities on the architectural level. Since some time on, places where different communities and religions can celebrate have been built. Often these places are exactly poorly characterized. They are not considered someone in specific and at end do not belong represent anyone. Architecture has always had a role to play in religious worship, and religious architecture is often an example of human brilliance because it's the outcome of intellectual and emotional participation. We deal with two essential questions: how to relate urban space, how to deal with the coexistence of three monotheistic religions in the same place. That's our topic. It's important to define a new, innovative, and complex typology. Do you know that we use typology, we know this word. Okay. One else, the social and religious role of the interfaith center. It's an interior space with many functions for sacred activities and for social activities, dialogue and mutual understanding. In other hand, is a collective center for people in order to disseminate urban regeneration and a positive energy for the city. Can architectural space promote religious tolerance? And this is the sample that we got before the Simon Peretz in Tel Aviv. And this is, of course, not really just for another problem, but just because it's a good example. And ecumenical and interreligious dialogue as place of worship. We can say something. Architecture as well had a role to play in religious worship, and the religious architecture is often an example of human brilliance because it's outcome of intellectual and emotional participation. For the common home, we can say like this, an expression of religion that mankind has always expressed the best of art and technology. This is some word specific for our liturgy, of course, for liturgy of Christians, and we have a lot of all. This is the presbytery, all the lobby, and we have also the center. We call some place where that have to stay in the church. The altar, the ambone, we call ambone, the baptistry source, battistero, and confessional. The Christianity has three kinds of building. The church, this is a building used for religious activities, meaning belonging, assembling, congregation. La Basilica is a large, smaller and important church that has been given special ceremony, rites by the Pope, meaning open public court building. And the cathedral is a Christian church with content to set of bishop that serving as a central chair of a diocese, conference or episcopate. And here you see a sketch given with all the elements that we have to build and to think in the side of this. This is like a church. And bell tower, lobby, nave, there are the liturgical hall. But it's really important because the church, the religious building, has this secondary function in the town, in the city. Charity as a public space, as a center of the community, is a daycare and groups. And this is some example of this. This is really important, Santiago La Sapienza, that you know very well from Borromini. But there are, this is in the center of Rome, and it is also, you know, the first building of Sapienza of our university. But there is also some church in outskirts. For instance, this is a really good project that realized this architects called Anselmi in outskirts of the city Malafede, is in the south of Rome, that became also a public space, really a square, a urban square. It's really important because in this outskirts there is anything else. There is only a church, like the public spaces. And there is a lot of space for community also, because also there is the church, but there is also some building for the community, a theater, and hall, and some space for staying. The same things in a little, it's not little, but it's an important church in Flaminio, that is not really outskirts of Rome, now it's in the center, but it's really important because this beautiful project built from this Francesco Berarducci, is an architect really famous in Rome. They built this church that's now also in Flaminio is really a point of meeting. There is a public square, there is some place also, the hall, but also some little space for the people. And also another example that is really interesting example in Taranto is the Cathedral of Gioponti. Gioponti, you know, because it's really important architect from Milan. And he built in a called cathedral, it's main cathedral, not the principal cathedral, but the secondary cathedral in Taranto. But they think also at the big square, at the center of common space, because you see it's outskirts of Taranto, and they think at this church like a center for the town. There is another example. This is another example of Verducci. Is a Torre Spaccato Rome, and you see there is a big square, and there is a really important space for this outskirts. That's called Torre Spaccato. Yet there is a my project, just to see, because it's our project in Sardinia, and also we think at a lot of space for the people and the space for a public square. But we think at the second religion, Hebraism, we have other important point: ornamental closet, Aaron, il rollo slow, la Torah, il platform, il bima, and this kind of building has to integrate these things. The secondary function also are place to meeting, public spaces, community, daycare, community center, charity, town hall, sometimes it could be discussed, Hebrew learning, Bible study, Bible and coffee, and also a cashier shop, because they need this kind of shop. This is our some image, the Semper Synagogue. They are really handsome. And the Synagogue of Prague, that's really famous. But the new one, that's Mario Botta, is a really important architect. They did this kind of two tower. But he built also a public square and in a big hall. Another really interesting synagogue in Monaco. The architect is Fleur, and they do a reinterpretation of contemporary synagogue. And another at Dresden, there are some interesting building. But we can say also the Islam as some point, il Mishrab, il Minbar, la Musalla is a little mosque, Matronel, it means that the women has to stay separated, how do you say? Fountain and minaret, no? That were the element topic inside the building. So, meaning the mosque is place of worship, protection, prayer, to bowing down in prayer and worship. And this is all the element in the sketch that are inside the building. You say the minaret, the courtyard, the Eblish fountain, that's really important, the portal, the minbar, and all the things. And the sacrament function of the religious building here also are the courtyard gathering place, the public space, the community also here, the cultural center, the courthouse, the school, sometimes university, bazaar, and the center of the public life. And this is the more famous Dome of the Rock and La Mecca. And some really interesting building in the past that you know very well, of course. Istanbul, but the new one also. In Rome, you know, there is a mosque. They Paolo Portoghesi, that's really another important architect in Rome. He built the mosque in 1975, and he built also, maybe thinking, the public square and the big hall for the mosque. So, it's possible to have an interfaith sacred space that will welcome and accommodate the needs of practitioners of all religions, a space where everyone who enters will be inspired to practice their own faith and build relationship with those of other faith? Big question. There are multi-faith rooms in all the world, no? You know. But there are new kind of sacred environment in which anyone can pray whatever their religion, or multifunctional room. Their design is an open problem because the multi-faith space is a quiet location set aside in a busy public space. For instance, there are a lot in hospital, in university, in airport, where people were of different religious belief or not at all are able to spend time in contemplation or prayer. This is a famous Rothschild couple in Texas. Yes, I think you know. But there is a neutrality religious. Spaces are small, clean, large. Sometimes it's an adorned area without anything. We can say that it's an intentional space designed to both house a plurality of religious practice as well as an address clearly defined practice purpose. Look at, there are space really as active, we can say. And this is a lot of little plan of some of this space. We can say that today there are multi-religious spaces that don't have a precise symbolic definition. They are hybrid and multifunctional rooms, and the increasing widespread meditation rooms inside airports, hospitals, or universities, or something like that. Multi-religious space. Multi-phase architecture is an architectural means for interreligious dialogue, such as it seeks to improve the tolerance and understanding between different congregations. In this sense, how to put in relation this new urban space with the city, and how to deal the coexistence of three monotheistic religions in the same space. In consideration of the sensibility of the last question, the architectural project will be proposed to satisfy individual needs and react an imposition of a specific course. Relationship, the topic that we are studying, relationship with the tradition, the relationship between man and nature, man and sacred space, man and commerce, man and his socialization attitude. The interreligious center will be a place of study, dialogue, and prayer for the three monotheistic religions, capable of becoming space for integration based on mutual respect for specific identities. For this reason, the project will be characterized both by place for prayer and space for cultural activities. In fact, there will be an educational and cultural center made up a library, an exhibition hall, classroom for reading and meetings. And as for the sacred space, there will be three large halls for worship, three different, for the different monotheist religion that we think that they're really important, that there are three different. The aggregation of this place will be set on interstational space full of nuance and sensory experience in charge of solving the two main issues of the project. And so, place for prayer and space for cultural activities. There will be an a cultural center made up of library, exhibition hall, classroom, reading, meeting, 3 large halls of worship for the different monotheistic religion. A aggregation of this place will be set an interstitial space full of non-sensory experience. This is scheduled, but this is, we would like to show some experience, some example. This is one of House of One. This is a project realized, not really realized, but project in Berlin. I think that you know very well. When Malvezzi is 3 architects, one is an Italian architect, 2 German architects, that they thought at this kind of House of One. There is a result of an international competition. I think it's quite interesting. You see a big hall. I can explain here. There is a library and all on the first floor. There is a big hall for like a place to stay, like interior square on the center, this one. And there are 3 little synagogue, one church, and 1 mosque. That's really not mosque, but a musalla that are around the big square. There are some image, some rendering of this space. Look, this is the space in the center. There are another interreligious center project in Barcelona, and where you can see some picture. And this is the plan, and there are the three religion, the synagogue, the church, and the musalla, and a space for like an old public space to meeting, and a public space to stay inside. And there is a model of this. But we would like to show, I have some minutes more. I would like to show some project that we have done in Rome, in the outskirts of Rome. The outskirts is Monte Spaccato, in the south of Rome. It's a kind of skirts really auto-built. But it's quite interesting because there is a space for the church that the piano regolatore of Rome call like a space for church, as public spaces, but for church. And we decide to in accord with SEI, to convert in a multi-religious space, and so we have done a project. It's here. This is a project, and we built this project like a public center with a square with 3 little hall. One is a capella, is a little church. One is a musalla. One is a little synagogue. And we put all together some place to stay, like a little library, a space to stay, 3 mensa for it, which is different, of course, mensa, and a big garden to stay, and a space for all the quarter. That's quite important because this kind of typology, it becomes a center for the city, where the city can meet, where the people can stay, and not also for to pray, but to stay all together. And we believe that it could be really interesting things also in the outskirts. It is the map. You can see the church, the synagogue, the mosque, and all the complexity of the architecture. This is another example in Milan. Milan is quite important because they, not now, but 3 or 4 years ago, they decided to build some multi-faith center, but after now they decided it's not the time. So, but they decided the area. So, one area is in San Donato Milanese, the outskirts of Milan, and they decide that this is students. They decide to build this kind of center. Also here there are 3 all different and a space common for all together. This kind of project are really linked to landscape, so it could be a really center of this kind of part of city, and there are 3 important because there are 3. Look, the 3 all and the space for. This is some image. Look, synagogue, mosque, church, and all the public space. And this is our some image. And another thesis with other some image. Here, for instance, in this example, you can recognize the 3 elements, the 3 buildings, which are really important. And I think I finished. I don't know if you understand all the things because I just simplify a little bit the problem, but I think it could be interesting to discuss about our problem because never the architect think of this kind of place and this kind of center. So I think it could be interesting to discuss also with you that you are not architects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Gwendalina, why don't you stay? I'm suggesting that since we're going on for the discussion, that the other presenters would join me, actually us, here at the table so you can answer questions. You want a 5-minute break? If we don't disappear, if we take it 5 minutes?
Disappear.
I haven't.
We have the treating at the end, so I hope you stay till 6:30.
Okay. Okay.
For one call. Okay.
5 minutes? You want 5 minutes? Now, if
I thought that people need it, but they don't seem to be.
all right. Okay. So then let's come here and we'll have a maybe we can put this down through the sides. Okay, good. And I think we can start the discussion. Whoever wants to ask questions. We have 3 very rich presentations with different viewpoints and expertise. And we have plenty to discuss. And I'm waiting. If there's no one, I'll start with some just questions as they come to mind, as they came to mind from listening to you. From Irene, I would like to prompt you. What is it? Oh, it's the food for later. It's a sign of the food coming in. Okay, I'd like to sort of prompt you to say more about this concept that you brought in of spirituality. And that comes in also in this as a stimulus from the last presentation by Gwendolina Salome. But you pointed to this aspect of places of spirituality in the city, in the special partition of the city, and I'm interested in listening and hearing from you more about where you see the difference between the sanctuary as a place for religious worship and the sanctuary as a place for spiritual, how should I say, meditation or something like that. One of the authors that is looming large here, namely Durkheim, made a lot of the distinction between spirituality and religion, because spirituality has a relationship with magic in a way, without being magic at all. But we need to understand the relation between spirituality and religion. We have to bring in another big divide between the private and the public dimension. Because spirituality shares with magic the fact that it can be practiced on a private dimension, which is something that religion cannot. So whereas it's a kind of contradictory statement to say that you could have a private religion any more that you could have a private language, it makes no sense whatsoever. It does make sense to say that you have a private relation to magic or to spirituality. It could be private. So when we think of the special spaces in the urban, the special partitions in the urban spaces that are devoted to spirituality, how do we negotiate that? And you talked about holistic milieus and as spiritual places, and I'm interested in seeing how you, especially in times of diversity and in times of where diversity means not only religious diversity, but also the diversity between religion and non-religion. So how you can accommodate places of spiritual significance for non-religious people. So that is something we would want to hear more. And from Annie Grave, then later I'll ask you more about that friendship book that you quoted at the beginning as a very interesting one. And I was very much interested in the Durkheim-Freud parallel of ritual and symptom, and you mentioned the ability of ritual to accommodate diversity, something that with Massimo drew it from Seligman, as well, Adam Seligman, whose work you may be familiar with too. We think of ritual as something that reinforces the same thing, but ritual is also, both Seligman and Massimo emphasize, the place where you accommodate diversity without generating conflict. So a way of accommodating diversity. And one thing that thrilled me about Tokyo back in the Edo period, I've been personally a visitor to Japan many decades ago and was fascinated by the way of negotiating modernity and tradition. I was struck by the fact that students of the University of Tokyo in 1985, so over 30 years ago, but students in a major metropolitan area and studying at a secular institution would think that it would be absolutely perfect, actually desirable to have their marriages arranged by the family in a metropolitan context. Not in a rural context in some Mediterranean community, but in metropolitan Tokyo. They would think it would be fine. They had much more advanced electronic devices that we had. I remember as a present we bought a Vivaldi record, and people looked at our host looked at us and saying, "What is this?" Because they had CDs already in 1985, but at the same time, the same family that hosted us would think that it would be proper to arrange marriage for the kids. And there was this way of mingling the two. And the other thing that struck me was the discussion. I mean, you mentioned the fact that Edo was a 1.3 million metropolis in the 18th century. So was Paris and London. London didn't reach 1 million by the year 1750, but Paris did. And the striking thing was that if we take three major authors of the time, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Diderot, they were all involved in a debate about what this form of life, the metropolis, does to the individual, how it transforms the individual. So Parisian, so Western. No trace of that in Edo. What was Edo? How was Edo? What was the reflection of that dimension, which was unique in Japan? Because the word, I don't know how large was Kyoto. I don't think it reached 1 million at all back then. So Tokyo again was like the Paris of Japan and possibly of the Far East, along with Shanghai. But how would they perceive that, and how would that be reflected in religious buildings? Finally, one reaction to the fascinating presentation about architecture and building interfaith spaces. At the time of the communitarian debate and critique of liberalism in the 1980s, a renowned author like Michael Walzer wrote a piece. I forgot the title, but I can recover it later by written documentation about the dream of the hotel room. The hotel room, the Hilton hotel room, taken as a paradigm of a hotel room. The hotel room has to accommodate people that come from all sorts of homes without being a home. So it has to be comfortable, a hotel room, for people coming from different homes without even dreaming that it could become a home, except for, Parisian avant-garde of the 1930s, people like Hemingway or others who would live in hotels in Paris, but it's a transient place. It has to accommodate. But then this was part of the communitarian critique of liberalism by saying liberals want to shape the institutions of society as a hotel room that is good for everyone and for no one. Now, when you as an architect approach the task commissioned to you to create an interfaith place, site, how do you negotiate this relation between the hotel room syndrome, it's being good for everyone and no one especially, and at the same time giving significance to it, and how do you reflect in the architectural work, in a way, the contextual roots? Interfaith is not universal. We're talking here about the examples you gave, some of them are truly nondescript, good for any faith or also no faith, namely meditation. But some, these what do you call it, intermonotheistic places, they're good for Jews, Muslims, and Christians, but how do they relate to Buddhists, to Hindu people, or to people who are they're really so the interfaith place seems to me still need to be reflecting some context. Monotheism is a pretty heavy context, and far from universal. And far from universal. I mean, I'm thinking of African reality, religious reality, or the Eastern one, and not to mention the non-believing spiritual person. In that sense, think of, just throwing this out for all of you to reflect, think of ground zero in New York City after, the monument, after the place, after the place where the Twin Towers were. That's the real challenge of architecture, and at the same time of an interfaith and no faith place of remembrance. Remembrance is the term there, spiritual remembrance, and relating to an event which is all contemporary, 2001. So it's in our century. It's the marking, the boundary, temporal boundary that ushers in the new century. And yet, ground zero has to be built not for one religion, but for everyone and place of no religion. So some of the questions for each of you, and then maybe if you want to add, if you're ready to ask questions, raise your hand and then ask them, or if you want to hear the answer, whatever. More questions? Yes, please. Celestino Mussomano, you want to ask?
So my question is for Irene and Peggy. I think one of my interests is contextual philosophy. So my question is.
Can you speak louder?
My question is, it's enough to say the dialogue is only for when we put the different religions in the same place, or we have another possibility or elements for dialogue. I think when we speak about secularization, it's good to contextualize. It's what Professor Ferrara was saying, because another place of the world, another religions, is not possible until now, to speak about secularization. So Islam now we see is starting the process of secularization, meaning the situation of Arabian situation now. It's possible to understand the movement of secularization. But when we want to make an analysis, I think it's good to contextualize our debate, because if we cannot speak now in this moment about secularization or religious places between different religions. But if we speak about the Catholicism, Protestantism, or monotheistic religions, it's possible to make the analysis which we did. So I think it's good to identify another elements if we want to make it the dialogue between different religions in the same places. Thank you.
More questions? More questions? Marks of floor. Yes.
Just briefly, as a side note, I would like Irene, first of all, if really tells us something more about this city churches. I found it really interesting. And secondly, I think we want to thank everybody who has thought the creation of this panel, because it is a perfect way to remember Massimo, because the relationship between secular and post-secular or religious and the kind and multi-faith places were really among his main topics of interest. So this is maybe, I couldn't find a better way to remember him and his work. And yes, maybe one last note about the multi-faith places. we had sometimes a discussion with Massimo about these places because I remember once I told him that they reminded me of Esperanto, which is a very good intention because it is really an attempt made by really the best souls to open a space for communication, but nonetheless flawed by ethnocentrism. This is the way I call it as an anthropologist. Esperanto is basically based on Indo-European Western languages. And if you come from a tonal language like Thai or Chinese, you don't know what to do with it. Exactly, this is the point. I mean, 55% of believers are belong to monotheistic religions. These are more of the numbers. So what about all the rest? This is left outside. I mean, of course, in Italy we have this issue now of the dialogue with Islam, because that is the problem. But there are quite a few Hindus, Sikhs, and Buddhists. And just within Christianity, the multi-faith place tends to bend Christianity towards a Lutheran or Calvinist perspective. Catholics are used to have their religious spaces full of visual expressions. So again, I'm trying to understand if there is a way out for a truly multi-faith place, or these are only attempts to deal with what it is known to be a serious issue, which is the relation between Islam and the West. It seems like a way of tackling that issue more than a possibility to open up a space for a truly post-secular, the way Massimo intended, place where both believers and non-believers open up a meeting place to share.
I just wanted to add a personal thank you to all of you for this very rich contribution to our to a so important appointment for us. And just to add a little pieces of the puzzle, all of the inputs that have already been on the table. Okay, yeah, I just wanted to add a question about that is quite transversal. It meets all of your contributions that regards, probably a more general question which derives from Massimo's work and studies that regard exactly the if and how the post-secular frames works, and it's unusual and helpful reply to all the questions that we have about the sacred spaces in contemporary society. It means he was asking himself how these kind of places that you all describe that are somehow post-secular sanctuaries in his lexicon are really places in which, as Piero was suggesting, something happens, and this something is that the extent to which we can imagine the sacred elementary forms, the extent to which we can enlarge these elements or rethink these elements in the relation with the secular or with a different kind of religion. So how in these places is possible to rethink the elementary forms of the sacred in the light of an exchange with the secular that is supposed to be changing both the secular and the religious as well. This was somehow the one of his broad questions. Is the sacred still working in that places? Is how is changing in its elementary elements and fundamental elements, and what this kind of change is producing in terms of people's relation with the sacred and people's experience of the sacred in this place. So is it possible, is it a helpful idea to think that there are in all these places there are something that is working in the dialogue between the secular and the religious and changing the way people experience and consider the sacred?
Yes.
I have two questions. I have a question to the first lecturer. Can you please clarify a bit more the novelty of this urban spirituality? Because when we say that religious practices take secular spaces and religious spaces are used for secular purposes, we can find numerous examples in history how this happened. So how would you explain or elaborate the novelty of what happens today? What makes contemporary urban spirituality something special, original compared to what was before? And I also have a question to the third lecturer. Can you say a bit more about the way these interfaith projects, monuments are perceived by representatives of religious communities? Because I think that even the idea of a building where Lutherans, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox believers could come and pray together is already a breakthrough, and the idea of three different religions meeting in one place seems quite fantastic, at least from my Russian perspective. So can you elaborate more about the way representatives of religious traditions, communities react to such projects?
Okay. Any more questions? No? No. Okay. If not, then I'll follow the order. And we have about, say, 10 minutes.
I'll try to make it short, although the questions are very interesting. Thank you all of you for the interesting questions. I think many of them are about the spirituality notion. And what is really interesting is that there's a history behind the notion of spirituality, of course. And there are at least two strands of histories. One is rather within the, if you want, the Latin word with the Catholic heritage of Romanticism, which sees spirituality in the Latin word also linked to spiritus, the soul of the people, and actually was very clearly a spirituality within the religion. And so there's not that idea of the individual being all alone spiritual. Then in the Protestant Reformation time, it came more or less to be characterized rather as something that Ernst Troeltsch would actually have seen as a mystic experience, between, there's a sect, there's the church, and then there's the mysticism. So spirituality has been seen from at that time, for this sort of modernity, as something linked to the individual, to mysticism. The problem is that there's an overlap of history coming from the Oriental world, with the expansion of also yoga ideas and some ideas of coming from India in particular, where spirituality suddenly meant something that is general. This is a sort of an anthropological basis factor of human nature. So everybody has spirituality within. And then suddenly it becomes something else. So there's a whole debate between theologians, for instance, and sociologists. Theologians would say spirituality is something more general that actually is common to all religions, while sociologists would say, well, what you call spirituality is something that is a form of religion, is this privatized, subjective form experience. William James would have seen this in terms of experiences, or you have also Schleiermacher, I mean the whole romantic idea of what is religion in liberal terms. The problem is there's a sort of a Protestant bias behind that. In particular, if you look at what is spirituality and religion from a non-Occidental point of view, where we had this very nice experience once with a center for welcoming refugees, where spirituality was lived as a very loud experience with praying and shouting and crying and making loud prayers. So we thought about these people, if they find at ease, if they find themselves welcome in a place where spirituality means silence. So how can you make spirituality something which is not culturally linked, which is not contextual anyway? So it's very interesting also about this idea of why should something which is common be actually what is really perfect for Protestantism, silence. So this is a clearly ethnocentric Protestant bias behind what we today consider spirituality. So I think if this is a novelty, this is the novelty of today's way of doing urban spirituality. And actually my whole, and of course everything depends on what you look at history, where you look, if you look at antiquity, if you look at, but most of these secularization theories anyway refer to some sort of golden age of religion, I don't know, probably 18th, 19th century, from then the decline came, so basically, or maybe sometimes going a little bit back, more, 1 century more, but that this is more or less the golden age. So it's more a reaction to this theories of secularization seen that teleologically as an eclipse of religion. Maybe also, I mean, I didn't have any normative point of view about dialogue or religions. What is really interesting to see, to put some case, and I really did some historicization to contextualize it because it's not general. What is general could be this idea of using space theory, really, using the approach and bringing in the space when doing analysis, and not only what people say, what they do, or what the institutions say, but also how do they relate to the space? How does the space make them do things which they wouldn't do otherwise if the space was different? And about dialogue, what is interesting to see with the case of Potsdam is that suddenly, and Luca Bossi knows it very well because studying that the role of interreligious dialogue in the recognition processes of new religions. It's more and more becoming an imperative. If you are not involved into interreligious dialogue, you are not going to be recognized officially by the state authorities. So there's a strong sort of use now of dialogue as an imperative to show your integration. But there are religious communities that don't want to dialogue, that they are not, they are harmless, they are not doing anything, but they don't want to enter into dialogue. So there's a whole issue there. Why and how, what does it mean for our times that this interreligious dialogue is becoming so important and so normatively loaded? And I think it's really, it aims to be inclusive, but there's still exclusion. I mean, there's still people who are not in the dialogue. Clearly. Well, I don't have really time, but the city churches are extremely interesting. What we can say there is also the role of academics, maybe more than anything else, because they base very much their strategies on the work we are doing, on reading, analysis done by sociologists. They're doing their PhD also as practical theologians, and basically the strategy of the city church I was observing, but there's similar cases in Berlin too. There was this church actually in the Babylon cinema, which is clearly very avant-garde cinema. They were having their inter-services there, and I think it was called the Berlin Project. Their church was called the Berlin Project. A similar city church is the ICF, the International Christian Fellowship. They never talk without a microphone, for instance, so they have to amplify everything all the time with music and everything. And it's interesting how they base clearly this Protestant church on a PhD work done by other colleagues of them in universities, where they clearly show how you can implant your church in this. And they use this special ideas also. They think the time is over of churches. Churches as places to welcome really religion are no longer the future. They think you have to go out, reach out to people where their secular activities are. They are also in this idea of the secular space as something dangerous, that it's better to sort of turn into more religiously attuned activities. Thank you.
Thank you. Annie?
Yeah. I'm happy for your remark on similarities between Tokyo and Paris. Because I've also become a aware of that fact, and I was so surprised to see the many similarities the more I digged into the different type of material. So, what are the differences and what are the similar things? And I would say that if we go to Diderot and these thinkers, they were very much on trying to formulate a future way of looking upon the relationship between the public, the private, and the common, and the sacred, so to speak. Talk much about the separation of these. And if we turn to Tokyo or Edo, I have tried to take a closer look into these places which are in a complex, stood in a complex relationship to the public sphere, the public realm of power, which was the Tokugawa era, and then looked at the marketplace, places for performing arts, and then the sacred place. And there are similarities in the sense if you take the marketplace, it became a kind of Pandora's box, just like in Europe, in the large cities, because here a completely new form of conversation developed, as Habermas has described in his public sphere. And what I did not talk much about was the sacred, and I think that is actually quite interesting. What is the sacred about, and what kind of life can we talk about here? When we say that the sacred stands also in a complex relationship to the public, it is something different, so to speak. And here I have later come across again the work of Jacques Derrida, and I've become very interested in Jacques Derrida. And he speaks about the cura, which was the place in Greek, the old Greek in antiquity. The cura place was the place where for offering, the offering thing, but it was also considered as a kind of grave markers, but it was also something with the woman and the womb, the origin, giving birth, and something warm and something. So it's filled with metaphors that you haven't got really a clue about. But what I think is very important is to think about these different places, public, private, sacred, and the commonplace as different. And when we talk about religious spaces, and in particular when we talk about what do they share, then we have to go back to some kind of the history of the term sacred. What is it about? What is it? How does it differ from the other places? But again, the public was, of course, the realm of power differed radically in Japan compared to Europe. So they didn't have a democratic revolution and all these things that we have seen. So in a way, today you can talk about the emergence of a dual civil society, one which is in relationship to the public, which is weak, and another one which is more societal, which is stronger. So they have a weak democratic tradition in Japan.
When we begin to think about this thing, of course we decide to have to think to a decision. We say, okay, the city needs to this place, but we can think in a place where all the religion is quite impossible, I think, kind of my point of view, of course, because we have seen that in the world there are some some place for all, but when you speak with the head of three religion, monotheistic, we choose this one because in Europe there are more than the other, but they say we don't recognize this place like a space for the religion. So we don't recognize this place. So we said, okay, we have to do a place that is recognized by both, by all the three. And so we decide to speak with them. The master that we begin at the university, it's in this sense, because at the end we just do the project for church, and we have done project for church. You know that the church for the architect is really the important thing that we have to do. I don't know, is the project for the life, no? Because it's really difficult to project the church. But we decide to say, okay, we put on the table all the three important religions in Europe and say, okay, how we can do a place for all that you recognize. Because if you don't recognize the place, it's not really a religious place. It's a place for meditation, for relax. I don't know, you can, but Irene can explain better than me. But it's not, because we have another problem. We have to build, to project a liturgy also. Because all the three religions has a liturgy different. And so they ask us, the mosque, the musalla is linked to the Mecca. The Jews say, no, we have to the Jerusalem. The church has to say the apsid is on the east. So everyone has something that you have to project in this kind of place. So we can project a place for all. So we say, okay, we can project a place for all. So, but we can do for the city, we can do a place where these three religions can meet, can stay together, then study together, then have some place to stay together, to eat together, but with different free kitchen, because everyone has, no, you know, the kasher and the other different kind of eat. So we say, okay, we can do a place, and we say that could be a really cultural place, really important in our city. Also for the outskirts, for the suburb, because you know now we have a problem. We have a lot of people that came from other parts. A lot of people are Muslim, not only Christians. So we can say, okay, we project a place where we are three little place for pray, a little musalla, a little cappella, we say chapel, and we can say a little synagogue, and each of one has the kind of typical liturgy that we showed before, no? Because it's really important for all the three, but there are some common space to stay. And there is also really important things that could be really a neuralgic point for the town, for outskirts, because you know the outskirts now is a really architectural problem, but you know that we need some place where to stay, because all of our outskirts are just to live. There are a lot of house, but not place to stay, common place, public space. There are not library, there are not school, there are not place square. All this space are all done for the car and not and not for the people. So we say, okay, we can try. This is just some experiment to try to project some place where the three religions recognize that this place is for all the three, all of them. Because if not, they don't recognize them. That is the symmetry, no? You know that there are some places where you can do some function, but they don't recognize this function really like a function for the three religions. So we have to try to understand with them how can do. And that is, I think it could be interesting. For instance, in Berlin, they say that there are a problem of eye of the building, because the building is not, the three places are not high in the same line. There is one that's a little bit higher than the other. So this is a problem. So they have to stay in the same ground, the same level, and the same position, no? In the same. So it's not really easy. So we try to understand them. I think, of course, we don't. We can project a place for all the religion. It's quite impossible. So we say, okay, how we can do? The Conferenza Episcopale Italiana ask us to say, okay, we are interested in this problem. Try to do some project of this. I think it's really incredible things, because they are interested in this. And so we say, okay, we try to do some project all together. When we call to the master all the head of the three religion, the Braille community, they can, and also the Islamic community, they can. Of course, for the Islamic community, it's quite a little bit difficult, because they have not one head, but there are a lot of organization, no? So it's not easy to talk with all of them, and we discuss with all of them. But we choose one that is in Rome and in Milan, the Curas, that are quite interested, so we ask with them. And I think it's quite a good goal, because if not, they don't recognize this place. So we can do the place, of course, in the city. We can do the place for meditation. We can do some place in the hospital, in the university, in all the big, the airport. But they don't recognize like a place to worship, yeah, or really worship for them. And so we say, how we can do it? We try. And I think it's really an opportunity for the city also. And for the marginal town that a lot of people live all together, but they don't meet, they don't communicate. So it could be really interesting to have some experimental. We try to ask to the city of Rome to try to do it. I don't know. No, it's not really political, really decisional government, but I think I don't know if I answered to the question, but it's really a choice that we have done.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let me thank our speakers for their generous effort to bring out these themes, and all those who asked questions, and everybody for having come here. Thank you. Let's move outside. There's some food for us, refreshments, and then we'll meet tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Oh, one important thing. The room has changed, so we'll meet in the special Massimo Rosati lecture room up on the second floor, where those who have not seen that piece of spontaneous art will see that desk with his portrait drawn by students who wish to remain anonymous, and I don't know who he is, I don't know if we have any, but the person remained anonymous all throughout 4 years now, so no one knows, but the fact is that I walked in the room where there were final examinations, and Massimo used to lecture in that room, and somebody had drawn that portrait, which is quite a kind of, if I can say, a Durkheimized Massimo. It looks very much like that. And so it's up there, and we restored that thing. We put a glass pane on so that it wouldn't deteriorate. And tomorrow we'll meet up there, second floor, at 10 o'clock. Okay, let's go.